So the real crucial point here is figuring out the why. Like, do empires fall because of singular, dramatic disasters, say a sudden barbarian invasion or some rogue environmental catastrophe? Or are they actually brought down by predictable, systemic patterns of exhaustion? Well, the data tells us that those spectacular, fiery endings, they're usually just the final act of a very long, quiet play.
And this quote brilliantly illustrates that long, slow decay of power. It comes from the Roman historian Cassius Dio, who was observing his own civilization's gradual descent around the year 180 CE. He wasn't seeing an overnight collapse, right? He saw a slow oxidation, basically a fading of strength from gold to rust.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the illusion of permanence, then the 250-year cycle, the cost of overstretch, inequality and lost cohesion, plagues, droughts, and invaders, and finally, we'll ask, is history repeating itself? Let's get into it.
Section 2. The 250-year cycle, the predictable lifespan of superpowers.
What's really fascinating here is that researchers, like British General Sir John Glubb, found that empires, ranging from ancient Assyria all the way to the Ottomans, don't just fall randomly. They actually share a remarkably similar lifespan. History shows us the 6-step trajectory. It starts with energetic pioneer growth, which leads to conquest, bringing in massive commercial wealth and fueling an age of affluence. But here's the trap. That very prosperity inevitably breeds complacency, overconsumption, and decadence, which directly trigger the final stage, decline.
And here is the number that should honestly make you pause. 250. Across thousands of years of human history, that entire 6-step cycle almost always runs its course in roughly 250 years. That is exactly 10 generations. It's a staggering historical pattern that repeats time and time again, completely regardless of the technology or geography of the time.
Moving to Section 3, the cost of overstretch, when big becomes too expensive.
Let's unpack the first of the great forces of destruction, the crushing financial burden of maintaining a massive state. We see this through the economic concept of diminishing marginal returns. This is truly the silent killer of empires. Essentially, an empire harvests the lowest hanging fruits of conquest early on. It's cheap, it's easy, and it brings in a ton of wealth. But as they keep expanding, every single subsequent conquest or infrastructure project requires exponentially more energy, more administration, and way more money, until the whole system just becomes structurally rigid.
We can see this financial overstretch perfectly when we compare these two massive powerhouses. On the left, we have the Roman Empire, suffering a totally hollowed-out treasury thanks to endless military campaigns, stretched supply lines, and creeping inflation. And on the right, the Mongol Yuan dynasty in China. They completely drained their wealth on lavish spending and these incredibly complex failed naval invasions of Japan and Java. In both cases, they basically bankrupted themselves, trying to maintain the unsustainable.
Section 4. Inequality and lost cohesion, the internal rot of empires.
So, the second great force of destruction is lost cohesion, which happens when wealth becomes hyper-concentrated at the top. The crucial point here is the behavioral shift in everyday citizens during late-stage empires. Studies show both the Roman Empire and the Han Chinese suffered fatal financial losses because corrupt elites hoarded wealth and desperate peasants literally fled the tax system. Romans actually relocated specifically to escape tax collectors, causing a 50% revenue plunge by 431 CE. Meanwhile, Han peasants fled border barbarian raids, completely eroding the state's tax base.
As a result of all this internal decay, empires very often defeat themselves long before a conqueror even shows up. This quote brilliantly illustrates how Alexander the Great so easily toppled the massive Persian Empire. Alexander was formidable for sure, but he arrived like a well-rested boxer facing an opponent that had already gone 11 rounds. Persia was already completely exhausted by a civil war over the throne and a messy string of royal assassinations.
Section 5. Plagues, droughts, and invaders, the final straws.
Okay, so once an empire is destabilized by cost and lost cohesion, it just becomes a delicate house of cards waiting for the final straw. And history is full of these triggers. This table illustrates the architecture of imperial collapse across the globe. Whether we're looking at the Western Roman Empire facing nomadic tribes, the Songhai Empire falling to Moroccan firearms, or the Tui Tonga facing internal rebellion, The specific trigger varies, but that underlying vulnerability, the loss of internal strength, was universal. And we absolutely cannot ignore the environment here. Environmental shocks are massive threat multipliers. In 1331, the Black Death wiped out 90% of the population in China's Hebei area, which completely devastated the Mongol yuan's tax base. Over in Rome, a volcanic eruption in 40 BCE cooled the climate and wrecked agricultural yields. And the mighty classic Maya civilization? They were ultimately depleted by prolonged megadroughts. When a state is already weak, a change in the weather can literally be a death sentence. It really is all about timing. Take the Inca Empire in South America, for example. The Spanish conquistadors didn't defeat the mighty Inca purely through superior technology. No, they arrived precisely when the Inca were emerging from a brutal, exhausting 8-year civil war. The Spanish simply weaponized alienated peripheral groups against an empire that had already lost its internal cohesion.
Which brings us to Section 6, Is History Repeating Itself? The Modern Handoff.
Now, researchers impartially apply these exact same analytical lenses to the modern era to see where we stand. Looking at this timeline, in the 1800s, the British Empire peaked, but crushed by the astronomical cost of 2 world wars, a virtually bankrupt Britain handed off hegemony in 1945. This led directly to the unprecedented Pax Americana, further cemented by the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. But notice the timeline at the bottom. The present day is rapidly approaching that critical 250-year cycle milestone.
And scholars point to these specific, data-backed symptoms to argue that modern hegemonies are indeed exhibiting classic late-stage warning signs of imperial exhaustion. We're seeing economies shifting from manufacturing toward financial speculation. There's widening inequality, deteriorating infrastructure beneath mountains of debt, and a deeply polarized public that struggles to even share a basic reality. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Highlighting historian Paul Kennedy's famous thesis on military overreach, experts point to this staggering number, $892.6 billion. That is the proposed 2026 U.S. defense budget. Combine that with an unprecedented global footprint of around 750 to 800 military bases worldwide. Kennedy argues that when military expenses spiral upward like this, fewer resources are available for domestic productive investments, which closely mirrors the overstretch we saw with Rome and Britain. Now, look at the wealth concentration. Just like the extractive elites of Han China, modern data shows wealth at the very top has reached historical extremes. The wealth of America's top 400 billionaires hit $2.7 trillion in 2017. Sociologists warn that this level of disparity severely damages the internal domestic cohesion that a state desperately needs to survive massive external shocks.
Finally, what comes after the fall? Transition, not apocalypse.
Here is the good news, though. This is not a doomsday prophecy. Remember, Rome fell, but the Romans kept right on living. They just adapted to a new, multipolar reality. Institutions evolved, trade continued. Historical patterns dictate that we actually have a choice. The only true choices moving forward are whether a decline is chaotic and denial-driven, or if it's a carefully managed transition to something different but stable. And that requires dropping our comforting myths of exceptionalism and actively defending the institutions we have left.
So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to explore. History clearly shows us the pattern, but history doesn't strictly determine our future. Are we wise enough to recognize our place in the cycle and adapt in time, or are we destined to blindly repeat the epic downfall of every empire that came before us?